Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Again, thanks everyone for joining this advanced user webinar using OpenAir as a crystal ball, I like to call it. It's really about forecasting in the OpenAir system. What I've done is I've muted everyone's line on the attendee side, and we will unmute that and open for questions at the end so that we can try and get through all the material within the webinar time frame. Okay? So thank you for attending the Forecasting in OpenAir, otherwise known as the Using OpenAir as a Crystal Ball webinar. This is the second in our series of advanced user webinars that we'll be doing monthly over the course of the next year. So what we're going to cover is just an overview of what is forecasting in OpenAir, what does it cover, some key configuration considerations of forecasting in OpenAir, the methods that you can use. There are a wide variety of methods possible in OpenAir. Choosing one is probably the most important within your organization to match the way that you're using the system and managing your company. We'll talk about forecasting frequency and how that relates to something like we call a pivot date. And then we'll talk about the revenue and the billing forecast, how that actually gets computed, how does it get handled. And specifically we'll highlight some of the rule setup that you may have run into troubles with and some tips and tricks on that. We're going to talk about how to forecast expenses. I don't see a lot of customers having that need because it's sort of an unknown entity, but there is some support or some ways you can do that if you really need it. And then we'll wrap up with reporting and the introduction or ways to do what we call weighted forecasting when you're working with your sales team and maybe accommodating the way the sales methodology, the sales funnel works as far as maturity or probability of a deal closing and how to reflect that same thing in OpenAir reporting. So let's go ahead and start with the overview. The overview of a regular accounting process in OpenAir is you have to have a project set up. You have to have people who are going to work on the project and rate cards perhaps or services and activities. You have to have rules set up. So all those have to be set up in order to do actual time capture, actual invoicing, and actual revenue recognition. You can see as far as once the projects are set up and the rules are in place, then it's just a matter of when do you enter time, when do you enter expenses, and when do you run the rules, when do you do revenue recognition, and of course if you are doing invoicing out of OpenAir or interfacing to an ERP system or financial system, when do you generate those? Okay, and that's just the workflow of actuals. I would have to say, 90%, 99% of OpenAir customers use the system to track actuals from timesheet capture to billing at least. Okay. But how does this change basically for forecasting? Okay. Forecasting actually starts with the same setup requirements. You have to have people and understand what their contract rates are in services. You still have to have projects. You still have to have these rules set up. But the forecasting takes a slightly different turn of events because it looks for future time, not actual time. So it looks for future time in most cases, and future time typically is tied to resource management or resource forecasting. Okay? So if you're the type of organization that hasn't quite bitten off that chunk of process, that resource management process, you may find yourself with limited capability to do forecasting because you need to know who's going to do what when or have an expectation. There are some ways to do some limited forecasting or some simple forecasting, I like to call it, and we'll get to those. But just know that to get an accurate forecast, you need to know what will happen in the future and not just know rates. You need to know time, right? But once you have that forecast of time, then OpenAir actually does this running of the rules and forecasting of the revenue behind the scenes in what's called the forecasting or charge projection functionality. So OpenAir takes care of running the rules on that forecast time, and it populates a series of fields that are specifically called projected something in order for you to do forecasting on reports. Okay? So the nice thing about the OpenAir and the requirements for doing forecasting is you already have to do 90% of the setup in the system. You already have to handle projects and actuals in the system. And then if you take that next step to do resource management, forecasting becomes something that you can do quite effectively. And of course, that is what we're going to be talking about through the rest of this webinar. So let's talk about configuring forecast and what does that mean in the system, configuring forecast. Now, the terminology that I'll be referring to is the standard terminology in the system. I will try to mention various renames that I see in a lot of customer environments. But first and foremost, forecasting is primarily controlled by a feature called charge projections. Okay, you may have it called time bill projections or line item projections, whatever you've called that that thing that you put on invoices. That's the projection functionality controls that. And it's actually considered part of a project setting or configuration in your system. You can see here by the path we have on the slide, if you're in the administration module, application settings, project settings, and go to charge projections, that's how you can configure your charge projection. So it's always a bit difficult to see it on the screen. I like to go into the system quite a bit. Hopefully that doesn't bother anyone. But if we go into administration, for those of you who are still using the account module, you would go to account, the company tab, and then you would go to the settings sub-tab. Or you may go to the projects module and the options tab because it's probably still configured there. So here's charge projections. And we're going to walk through sort of what all of these values are and how you can work through in your organization what would be the best match for your forecasting efforts. Okay, so this is where it's controlled. And as you can see, you can set it up to run periodically. Daily is usually recommended, but we'll also get into details and recommendations for that. So the first part of the form talks about what is your method? How do you forecast? Where do you get your future hours from? Okay. Hopefully a lot of these hours values sound familiar, but for many of you, booked hours may not sound familiar. You may have called them allocations. You may have called them staffing. I've also seen people call it resourcing. Anything that sort of uses that resources module to allocate people or assign people to projects without having to be inside the project. Okay. So as you can see from the options, it handles all different ways time can be captured or forecasted in the system. Booked and versus assigned hours. That is a very common debate on which will work better for your company. It does actually reflect how you're doing resource management, who's in control of resources. I find companies that use the assigned hours are more project management centric, so the project managers have more responsibility to make sure they're using their team effectively. Companies who use booked hours have a combination of management control, centralized resource management control, or project management control. So bookings is actually quite flexible. Assigned hours has some limitations. We'll talk about those. But I primarily see assigned hours used in project manager-centric staff needs, staff forecasting environments. One thing that you may find confusing about the approved hours as a forecast is, well, how can an approved hour be a forecast? Because it's time that you have already worked and put into the system. That's absolutely true. So it's more of an actuals forecast, ways that you can actually run forecasting and then compare it to actuals, but there's limited use for approved hours as a forecasting methodology, as you can guess. Worked hours may fill that gap. Worked hours are any timesheets, but just know that it also picks up projected timesheets in your forecast. So still very limited forward viewing, probably a week at the most, or maybe end of month if you're doing monthly timesheets. But those are the four primary. And then there's the a series of booked versus assigned where it's considered or combines with the timesheet options. And the thought process behind here is that I plan someone to work so much time this week. As they're entering or updating their timesheet, the values of the plan are replaced with the actuals. And theoretically, my forecast should become refined day after day, week after week, as people are updating their timesheet on a weekly or monthly basis. Okay, and we'll talk about these in the pros and cons way. So if you've looked at this and sort of been confused before, what I'm going to do is walk you through the positives and the negatives of each setting. No setting is better than any other setting as a universal use in the company, so this is something you really need to sort of stop and think about as far as how you're putting data in the system and how you're managing data in the system. Another part of the forecast is something we call pivot date, and this is always a very interesting conversation. So a pivot date is the point at which OpenAir starts computing a forecast value. Okay, so many accounts, as I see initially set up, the date that they got the account, from September 17th, 2010. Okay, that happens to be the date that's set up on the forecast, and that date is not changed unless you come up with a forecast methodology or forecast approach. So because you start using the system on September 17th, well, your forecast is as of the moment that you get OpenAir, September 17th. But there's other things to consider. There's other configuration items to consider. And specifically, you can set the start date to be something like on the start of a week or the start of a month, and it would forecast from that point forward. Typically that's done when there's some kind of month-end process that's done in the system, and you know anything before this date is an actual in the system. There's actual billing, there's actual revenue, actual time, and there's no need to forecast in history if there's actuals in history. Okay. But you want to forecast because perhaps like this month of December, if you're a monthly billing company, the forecast as of December 1st going forward means that as you're working in the month of December, you're watching to see how the forecast is changing and impacting based on work completed and understanding if you're going to be able to hit your goals in the forecast. Okay. But there's also another value called relative. And this works for organizations that are using some kind of timesheet entry activity. So the timesheet entry activity, when you have like approved hours or worked hours coming into the system, you may want to consider adjusting your timesheet based on those daily entries in the system, and that could be this relative date range. Relative date range says, I always forecast from today forward because yesterday people should have time in the system, for example, or maybe you use for tomorrow in the system. I do see this as a fairly new feature in the past year, so I do see this used a little bit, but not 100% or by any means the majority of customers. I still see a lot of absolute range values, absolute range being beginning of the month or beginning of the week. Okay? And as you experiment in your system on forecasting, you can see the impact and the difference of using absolute versus relative. And as we're going through this, and I'll try to make sure I say it at the end of the summary, the nice thing about forecasting is you can test all different ways and not impact a single piece of your system setup. So you can turn it on, you can try it with approved, change the setting, try it with assigned, change the setting, try it with bookings, and it will not impact any of your actuals, any of the project data you have in the system. So it's a nice feature that you can test on your own to figure out what's the best way for you guys to use it. So when I talked about the pivot date, hopefully it was clear when I said the pivot date is the date from which we look forward. And so many of you, if you're working with reports in OpenAir, the reports, you have tons and tons of values that you can pick and put on a report, right? But you may have noticed that there's a series of fields called projected something, projected billing rules, projected billable hours, projected cost basis hours, projected revenue rules. All of those projected fields are actually what is populated by this charge projection process. Okay, that's where OpenAir, when it runs its forecast, it configures or figures out the forecast value, and it populates that in these projected fields. The actual values that you have probably already been using quite a bit are just project or recognized or actual or something like that. So that's basically the difference. Is if you see the word projected, almost all fields that have the word projected means it actually comes from OpenAir's forecasting calculation. So let's talk about the pros and cons of all of those options that we talked about in the system, how to do the time billing forecast and stuff like that. So the charge projection methods that we talked about, approved hours. Like I said, it provides a forecast of actual billing and revenue. So it's sort of limited on its forecast time frame. So we've already gone through the pros and cons of approved hours and worked hours. I don't see these used very often, and if they are used, they tend to be used for the fact that there's really no forecasting going on in the system. Booked hours, however, there's a continual debate between booked hours and assigned hours, and that really depends on your operational model and how forecast time is used in your system. So the booked hours, the pro for booked hours is using bookings in the system or allocations in the system gives you very good control over resource management, even down to the individual day. And now with the start and end time feature in resource bookings, you can go down to the individual time of the day. That's a pretty low level of use of the data, but I usually recommend people put information at a weekly level or maybe even a monthly level just to get the forecast values in the system. They also support ways to sort of categorize the information, so allocation types or booking types, saying, yes, this is actually a commitment, this is an upside or a soft or tentative booking, and all of those are sort of stamped on the forecast, and you can filter those out of the forecast values if you want. You can get various ways to forecast, whether you want total upside forecasting or just committed forecasting, for example. And since bookings have a start and end date, you can actually control the value of each week even. So you can say, although the person has to work 100 hours on a task, they have to do 90 of those hours the first 2 weeks and the other 10 over the next 6 or 7 weeks as wrap-up activity. The con, however, is the accuracy of the bookings and the resource management in the system are driving your forecast. So if people are not keeping those up to date, then your forecast is getting hurt in the meantime. Okay? And as people actually work on the project, the time is not considered. So I plan on somebody working 100 hours. They decide they don't want to work it or they can't work it. I may still be forecasting that revenue coming in when in actuality there's no chance I'm going to get it because the person's not working on it. Okay? And for those of you who are working bookings, that tends to drive things like booked versus actual, periodic checks to make sure people are actually burning. And what I do instead of running a report like that is, because I use bookings in my system, I actually use a dashboard that kind of shows me the burn based on client work, based on people, of where when I expect somebody to work something, is it being worked? Okay, and reports are very easy to do that with, but with graphical dashboards, which you probably heard quite a bit about if you happen to go to the user summit this year, I use these graphs to sort of do even a daily check to come through and say, how are my individuals doing against what they should be working, number of hours worked, and then also based on the client work that I have in the system, how are we doing against the expected work on each of those projects. Okay, so that gives me a graphical quick check. You can do the same thing with reports, and that would be the plan versus actual reports. But assigned hours, so what's the difference between booked hours and assigned hours? So assigned hours are really the task level, the task assignment, where project managers are assigning people to individual tasks. Now, not everyone uses tasks on projects within OpenAir, but if you do and you have a strong project management focus using the system, this is where you can have them control the forecast and by using assigned hours. Now, the difficulty part of using assigned hours is that when you set up a task, the depending on how you are using tasks, there's 3 different ways to basically put time and people together on the task in OpenAir. But how you're doing it, OpenAir will definitely take the start date and the end date of that task and just spread the time across evenly from the start date to end date for those tasks. So the downside is you lose granularity or control if, for example, somebody is assigned to work 100 hours over the next 4 weeks. OpenAir will say, oh, it's 25 hours a week. But they decide that they're going to really work hard the first 2 weeks, and they work all 100 hours in 2 weeks, and they work nothing the other 2 weeks. So depending on where those weeks fall, it could be all in 1 month. It could be a split between 2 months. You don't have control. You don't have control to say, well, that person is going to do it up front, more up front, and less later on. Okay. I've worked with companies where they definitely say, well, you can always change the end date and stuff, and that's absolutely true. But if many of you are using project management in OpenAir, maintaining those dates on a potentially detailed task level is an overhead administration effort that PMs typically don't have the luxury of doing. So, sometimes to be able to get more accurate forecasting, the assigned method becomes a little more problematic. Or there's trade-offs in accuracy, and it's known and understood that the PMs are doing a best guess forward based on loading the task based on people. Okay. So it's definitely, I'm not going to be able to give you a lot of answers on this call between which method to pick, booked versus assigned, but just know that there's trade-offs, and there is a slightly higher percentage of people using bookings because they can delegate that beyond the project manager realm. Assigned hours is more for project manager-centric companies. Now, I put all of these other ones together, assigned hours with approved or worked hours and booked hours with approved or worked hours. And this is the theoretical refinement of forecasting as actual time is being put in the system. And the refinement, of course, depends on whether you use approved hours, which means you have to wait for timesheets to approve, or worked hours, which is time just putting onto a timesheet like an open timesheet or submitted. So theoretically, it could be the forecast could be refined every day. Okay, so so this method is chosen frequently with customers, but there's some things to consider, and actually a recent discovery based on some features released in OpenAir that has solved a long-time problem of timesheet effort or missing timesheet effort replacing hours in the system. So the pro of using this, definitely actual time being replaced by your guessing or your forecasting of effort. So it sounds like it's the best of the best option for many of you. But the cons is the timesheet hours replace the hours based on the time entry. So I forecast, like what does that mean? So I forecast 40 hours for this week. Okay, I put that in a booking or I put that on an assignment. So OpenAir says, oh, that's 8 hours for the 5 days: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Okay. Just know that when people work on timesheets, they sometimes don't adhere to exactly 8 hours a day. Some days they'll work 9, some days they'll work 10, some days they'll work 5. Okay. And so the forecasting gets refined based on the actuals put in the system. Okay. But it replaces it day by day. So I put 10 on one day and 5 on another. The 8 hours for Monday gets replaced by 10. The 8 hours for Tuesday gets replaced by 5. Okay, so my forecast actually goes from 16 down to 15, which is correct. But there has always been a challenge for those of you using the system for quite a long time. And the challenge has been, well, what if I don't work on the project at all? If in the book in the assigned hours method, if you did not put any time on the timesheet, so the example I have here is I need to work 10 hours on the project this week. So OpenAir spreads that across the time frame regardless of whether it's bookings or assignments because I'm putting the start date at the start of the week and the end date at the end of the week. And it just puts 2 hours per day to equal 10 hours altogether. But on my actual timesheet, I don't work at all on Monday. I don't work at all on Tuesday. I work all 10 hours on Wednesday. I work no hours on Thursday or Friday. So theoretically, I'm still hitting my forecast. And the way that the forecast would change day by day depends on whether I used approved hours or worked hours, as you can see. Unfortunately, up until some recent testing, and I do have to credit Jennifer Gamble of Red Prairie for helping us find this, this solution, the forecast would actually say, okay, well, if there's nothing on the timesheet, I have nothing to replace the plan. So I'm just going to keep pulling the plan hours. So you can see here in this last line, the forecast, it would pick the 2 hours up again and the 2 hours up again. And then, of course, because we worked on Wednesday, we can replace the Wednesday hours with 10. And then there's nothing on Thursday, so it picks up the forecast, picks up the forecast. So you can see here that by the end of the week, using this forecast method, we've actually forecasted 18 hours of effort, which is almost double. So we're overstating our forecast quite a bit, and that's always been a problem for companies using this methodology. How did it get solved? Well, actually, it was something that was released to support more of the bill rate by job code, or BSOE reporting requirements. And there's actually a feature that got released in July 2009, actually, to allow you to override a person's job code. So what is that? In your companies, it could be called job role, it could be called position, technical code. Basically, when somebody gets hired into your company, they're given some category to be billed out in the services world, like a consultant or a senior consultant or a principal consultant or a project manager or a DBA, so forth and so on. Okay? So this is one of the fields that you could be calling it anything in the system, but just know that it's usually used as a category of the type of resource you are when you work on a project. Okay? So a feature was released because many of the companies using OpenAir have a requirement to be able to show that if you're a software product company and you also sell services, that you're not giving services away in order to get license revenue. So you have to adhere to bill rates and publish those rates or price lists in your company. Okay. So how is that done? Basically, if people are being put into different positions within the company, like a project manager or a DBA, but they're actually a consultant, then you have to make sure you override that to say, well, they were acting as a DBA and that's why we charge them more. Okay? And then you can get average job code bill rates in the system. Now what we find is, people who are using this feature, they have it turned on and they're actually getting the benefit of the feature, obviously, by having it turned on. And the way that it works is when you create this override, you set the job code to come from the user level or maybe a booking or maybe a task assignment. You have to tell the system where to look first to find what the job code is. Okay? But for many of you, if you actually just turn this feature on and say, always look at the user for the job code, what it does is it forces the time entries that are blank to use 0 as a replacement for the forecast. Now, it seems like that should have been available in the system for quite a long time, but actually this job code override feature, it has very strict rules or calculations behind the scenes that make sure that, just like the cost center feature in OpenAir, it's inheriting things the correct way and it's driving correct use of the job code and the effort going forward. So for those of you who have always struggled with this approved versus booked or worked versus booked and assigned hours and not getting the forecast to come out right because values are not getting replaced, simply activate this job code feature and just tell the system always get the job code from the user. That will mimic exactly the same way that you're using the system now, except it will force blank time entries to replace your forecast value with 0. So in our previous example, the forecast line, it would actually pick up 0, 0, 10, 0, 0, and forecast of 10 hours, which is just what you want. Okay? So let's talk about billing rules and revenue rules and how setting those up can influence how the forecast comes out. Okay? So fixed price, milestone, or date rules, of course, they're going to continue to use the date that's on the task or in the rule to forecast. Okay? There's really no impact on the forecast method here. It's just a matter of, it's going to forecast on this date. The percent complete rules, I will tell you that well, about 99% of you guys that use percent complete rules for billing are actually doing it based on like a milestone completion, which means the milestone hits 100% or this phase hits 100%. Okay. There are the cases where I see people saying when it hits 25, bill a certain amount, 50, so forth. But it's usually 100%. And what OpenAir will do in the 100%, 100% means the project is, or the project is done, or the task is done, or the milestone is done. And in that case, this percent complete rule for forecasting turns into the date of the end of the project or the date of the end of the task or the date of the milestone. Okay, so if you use 100% complete, just think it's going to just pick the end date for the value here, when to forecast. The expenses and the purchases options have no forecasting capability at this point, but we will show you how you can do forecasting from a cost perspective if you'd like there, or billing. And then, of course, the time billing rule has lots and lots of options. So I thought I would take a moment to kind of walk through some of those billing rate methods and how they will work in conjunction with forecasting. Okay? So user rates, quite a few use user rates and rate cards, easily handled in all forecast methods, no limitations on assignments, bookings, that kind of thing. Service forecast, usually you're setting up a time billing rule with a default service just in case there's nothing to pick up on a task or a timesheet, for example. Those also work with all the different forecast methods in the system. Just know that you might have a slight difference between assigned and booked, because assigned, sometimes people are putting service on the task, so the service will actually be inherited as part of the forecast method and forecast that type of service. If you're using bookings, you may not be putting service on the bookings. So what it'll do is it will default to whatever the billing rule service is going to be in the system. Okay. Job code is a recently new addition to the billing method, and job code also can work in conjunction with that job code override. When you're doing forecasting with billing or bookings and using a job code override, it will actually compute correctly as the same as with assignments. But we have found that if you're doing actual billing with job code overrides, you may have some challenges based on date matches of timesheets versus bookings. But that's for another discussion. So we'll let you know that the forecast should work okay. Actual billing may have some impact. So what about all those filters on a time billing rule? All those filters, you can filter by person and job code and service and time type. And again, you may have renamed all of these things. But when you filter on a user, since forecasting is typically user-based, how many hours will this person work? Having filters on the user on these time billing rules is not a problem at all. Job code, we just talked about that, and service, those are all handled very easily as well. But time type and task filters tend to complicate things a bit. So a lot of you may be using time type saying, I only want to pick up billable time or whatever the definition of your time type is. And when you start doing forecasting, you may end up getting 0 values showing up in the forecasting when you know the person actually is working billable hours, or you've planned them to work billable hours. And for task filters, you plan on somebody working 100 hours on a project, but you are charging different rates based on on-site versus off-site, which may be a time type or a task filter, and so OpenAir can't figure it out, and it gives you zeros. So how can I fix that in the system? So if you are getting zeros in the system, what you can do is you can actually set up, there's 2 ways to do it. One would be on the time billing rule, make sure you add the no blank value, no time type, no task type, or task value. And that will help alleviate those items that don't have an association of a time type or a task type yet. What situations would that mean? Okay, if I'm using assigned hours, I know what task I'm on, so a forecast of time based on task filter, that works fine. But if you're using bookings, you have to consciously want to do bookings at a task level for the forecast to know what task you're talking about. Typically people do bookings at the project level. And because OpenAir can't figure out what task you're going to use, it just doesn't try to do anything, and it gives you a 0 in the system. So if you go to a time billing rule, I don't have the job code feature turned on in this environment, but if I filter on task and I say for the workshop and system updates project tasks, I need to bill at a certain hourly rate. For mentoring, I'm not going to bill on this. If I add no task, then the method that I'm using are the bookings, for example, that say, Joe is going to be busy this month, okay? That booking, because it has no task on it, will get picked up in this rule as a forecast. So when time is put on the project, my timesheets require a task. So I'll always have a task, which means if any time is put on mentoring, it'll filter it out. What if you don't have the luxury of picking no task? A classic workaround to address this in OpenAir has been to set up an additional time billing rule that runs at the very end, and it's called forecast only. And it uses a conservative bill rate for the people on the project, and basically anything anything forecasted to be worked, any task people are working on, any effort, will probably fall all the way through the billing rule logic and hit this forecast only so you can get forecast values. Now, depending on how complicated your rule setup is, a forecast-only rule should not actually run when you do actual billing, because the previous billing rules have all kinds of filters that capture everything else on the project. And I have worked with a few of you guys out there that have that situation. So when you're running billing, you should never see this forecast-only rule come up. It really is used to make sure that you get values on a forecast. So if the no time type or no task type value is not addressing it because you have pretty complicated rule set up, try setting up a forecast-only time billing rule, and that will allow you to do some forecasting. This would be the only change that could potentially impact actual project billing, but as long as you educate people using running the billing rules, they'll know to ignore those rules altogether. Okay, so forecasting frequency. It does look like we still have quite a bit to get through, but the next couple topics are actually pretty short. So how often should I run forecasts? I actually recommend that you run it every day. But there are probably situations, especially timing, right? If you're doing everything based on approved hours, it probably doesn't matter if you run it every day, maybe once a week or maybe once a month type thing. So you can set it up to run once a day or once a month. But at any time, if you want to force it to rerun, you can go into the charge projections, click on that Run Charge Projections Now, and save it. In the past, OpenAir would not let you run any forecast reports because it was being recalculated, but they've changed that now. And when you rerun the report, you have to make sure that the charge projections have stopped running in order for you to get a refreshed version of the charge projections. How do I know when it's done running? Well, when you click on the Run Charge Projections Now, and that's back in the administration area. And for those of you who are using the account module under the company settings, actually it's project module options, okay, charge projections. So if I do something with booked hours and I click Run Projections Now and I save, the field at the top is going to change and it's going to say charge projections are currently running. Okay. Now how long they'll take to run depends on how many projects, how big, how many users, how many everything is in your system. I have seen forecast projection and recalculations taking up to 20 minutes for some of your larger accounts. For a smaller account, even like myself, it takes about 2 minutes to run. So I just have to kind of keep coming back into this form, checking to see if it's still running. Oh, it's already done. So here, last run on 12/16. Okay. Now, what you may not want to do is, call up the help desk, because usually this is an administrator function. Say, I just finished updating my task plan. I just finished updating my bookings. I really want to refine the forecast, and I can't wait until midnight tonight when it runs, for example, or 10 a.m. or whatever the next time it's going to run. There is a feature you can turn on. It's an internal switch that will allow you to do reforecasting of an individual project. Okay. If you don't have this turned on, I do recommend that you have this activated in the system. And where does it show up? You actually see it on the project itself. And it doesn't hurt anything in the system to have that available and to reforecast. And then you can also provide access to your project managers and your PS managers when they are updating things in the system to refine their forecast. They can simply just rerun it for 1 to 2 projects that they've updated, and the forecast will be more accurate. So one of those very useful features, however, it's located way at the bottom of the project form. Down here in the tips area, you see Generate Charge Projections. When you click it, it pops up a window saying, here was the last project that we refined. If you want to run this one, you say Generate, and now it'll actually run a forecast calculation for this particular project. So we're going to go back to the pivot date. So say that you run your forecast every day, but you want to make sure that you're forecasting from the right period forward. Okay? So I do see quite often a weekly or a monthly, most often monthly pivot date set, which means you're using an absolute range on that charge projections, and that allows you to forecast forward. That does give you some advantages in calculations that we'll talk about in a second. But one thing I do need to point out, it has been submitted to OpenAir, is you may be forced to use a pivot date when you're dealing with billing rule caps on time. Okay, and what do I mean by that? So when you set up a rule, a time billing rule in the system, and you say, I'm going to cap this at 25 hours, for example. Same thing works with money, by the way. I'm going to cap this at 25 hours. When I go to run my forecast, it will say, okay, what have I actually run against this project already, or this rule already? So let's say that we worked 10 hours already. So I would say, okay, well, I worked 10 of the 25, so I have 15 left. Let me go and look at my forecasted time since the pivot date, as of the pivot date. Okay? And then I will decide if we're going to hit the cap or not. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. The problem is when you start running a forecast, and you don't have a pivot date, meaning that September 17th, I got the system on September 17th. I've worked 10 of the 25 hours back in October. I'm doing my forecast for December. So I should have 15 hours left to be able to be worked. Why is my cap getting hit sooner than I expect? It's because since you don't have a date that's ignoring actuals to some extent, it takes what you've already billed, okay, so the 10 hours that you've already worked, okay. Then it looks at the same time in the system and says, oh, here's 10 hours that you worked in October. Let me add that to my cap total, so that's 20 hours now. So you already processed 10 hours. Then it goes back and looks at that timesheet again and says, oh, there's 10 hours, so 20. So that means you only have 5 left to work after that thing. It actually counts the billed hours twice, okay. OpenAir is aware of this. But if you start implementing a pivot date that says, I only want to forecast from like this month forward, it still picks up the actuals, but it ignores the time that was done in October because that's historical time. I don't need to consider that or count that twice. I just count this month forward, so then I get the actual 15 that I need. Okay. That you might be surprised by that or not necessarily trust it, but try it. Try it in your system. Play with that pivot date. Again, can't hurt anything because you're only doing forecasting. Play with that pivot date and see how something that has a billing rule cap on it is impacted based on the fact that it counts billed hours twice in the system. Okay, so just be aware of that. So how do you do the forecast? Well, of course, we know that you have to set up the billing rules and you have to set up your charge projections in order to get those projected values in the system. But wait, there's more. Okay. Because this is an advanced user, I want to make sure that you're aware of a very simple way to do forecasting that is not dependent on anything I just got done saying, which is probably going to drive you crazy. But it's called straight line billing projections. What does that mean? So there is actually a way to set up in the system to do very simple forecasting. Start of the project, tell me when you think the project will end, and tell me how much you think this project is worth. And all it does is take the total value of that budget and spread it from the beginning to the end. So after everything I've gone through and all of those things that I would like you to test and play with and try out in the system, when it comes down to worst case, try straight line projections. It's the simplest, most straightforward way. It does not depend on resource management. It does not depend on billing rule setup. It strictly takes the budget value and spreads it between the start and end date. But the spread between start and end date is actually based on how large a month is. So in this example here, I'm showing $100,000 over 4 months. So logically in your mind, you could think, oh, well, 4 months divided by, 100,000 divided by 4 is $25K a month. Actually, that's not the way it works. OpenAir goes through and says, oh, there's 20 billable days in January, 20 in February, 23 in March, 21 in April. And it will actually do the forecast, the quote-unquote straight line forecast, according to how large those months are. And you can see how the forecast is slightly refined based on productivity of that month. Okay. But straight line projections are the simplest, most easy way to do forecasts. And if you want to give those a try, there is some detailed setup. Actually, it was a feature released a couple of years ago. We'll make sure if you have any questions, you can email OpenAir support or give us an email, and we'll direct you on how to set that up. Okay. In all cases, if you want to do forecast revenue, you have to make sure you tell the system you want to forecast revenue, and you have to have rules set up, even with the straight line projections. At a minimum, you have to have as-built rules, because there is no straight line forecast. Okay, there's revenue. There's straight line billing, and then if you set up an as-built rule on revenue, it will pick up that as forecast revenue. Forecasting expenses. So depending on if you're using assignments or bookings, it's basically the same approach. What you're basically doing is using a generic. Those are the placeholder, the fake people in the system. Call it forecast expenses, but you're giving that generic a cost of $1 an hour, for example, or 1 money unit an hour in the system. And what you can do then is based on if you're using assignments, the number of hours on a task represents the amount of money that should be forecasted for expenses. Okay? If you're using bookings or allocations, the amount of booked hours or allocated hours represents the amount of expenses you expect. So basically you're faking the system out to forecast expenses by using a people approach with a person that doesn't actually exist. It's the person represents expenses. So if you set the assignment up with $1 or bookings up with $1, then OpenAir just does the same forecasting method, forecasts it out, but you know since it's the forecast expense generic, it's actually forecasting expenses. I don't see this used very often. I don't see the need to forecast expenses very often when I work with customers. But if you do need to do it, then this is available, obviously. So that brings us to reporting and weighted forecasting. So reporting, we touched on the values that you should be using in the system at the beginning of the presentation. But here you can see the projected values, all the different projected values you can have. And a lot of them have that quote-unquote rules in parentheses afterwards. So the rules tell you that it's using those billing and revenue recognition rules to do that forecast. The only exception of when rules are not used is that straight line billing projection feature in the system. Okay, so if you're struggling with what fields to be putting on a report, make sure you just pull something that has rules in it and the word projected, and those are typically the ones that you want. Okay. But as you set reports up, then you're always challenged with what dates do I use? How do I get dates in the system? And specifically, recognition transaction dates. And what I want to kind of point out here is many of you are starting to use the accounting period and accounting date functionality in OpenAir, which is great because it gives you a whole other way to report on the data in terms of your accounting system and doing reconciliation. But when it comes to forecasting, it doesn't understand what a forecast accounting date is. So if you have reports set up that say report on recognition in the month of the accounting date in the system, that accounting date just hasn't happened yet. OpenAir doesn't have a forecast of when the accounting dates will change. So what it will do is, from a forecast perspective, it doesn't matter which of these values you set, it will always do the recognition transaction date. Just be aware of that. Okay. Obviously, when you're running a report of actuals, these do mean completely different things potentially, but if from a forecast perspective, it doesn't matter which date. So if you are using accounting dates, you may want to just always default this to recognition transaction accounting date for consistency, and therefore the forecast will be, just be aware that there's no forecast accounting date. So here's a common scenario of some of the forecast reports that we see in the system. I want to forecast my billing amount and my revenue amount, what's my cost, and what's my forecast margin. And OpenAir can do all that. OpenAir is taking everything that you've already set up in the system, and it's just doing this calculation for you. So you can do these types of reports very easily. But what I also find, and what I use in the system is, I don't want to forecast from today forward. I want to see how my entire fiscal year is doing, because I want to make sure I'm hitting my revenue numbers at the end of the year. Okay, so I want to not only know what my forecast is, but I want to add it to what I've already done, so I get a total revenue view or a total billing rule. Okay, a total billing value. So there's custom calculations in the system, if you're not aware, that are located within the administration area, or if you're using the account module, it'll be under the company tab in the custom time ranges, or custom calculations, sorry. And what you can do there is you can actually build a calculation that says, give me actuals plus forecast, okay? Simple enough. The calculation gets completed with, give me my projected value, right? So here's the total billing, for example. Give me my projected billing rules plus my project billing, okay? The main caution that I have to give everyone when we set up this equation, it is a very simple equation, but there is a timing concern when you run your forecast, because the forecast reports that you use this total billing on will add whatever you have billed to whatever you are forecasting, okay? And it will do that regardless of when you start running billing. Why is that important? That's where we come back to the pivot date again, okay? When you have a pivot date in the system, December 1st, for example, anything prior to December 1st will have a value in projected, will have a value in project billing, but projected billing will be 0. There's no forecast for historical, okay? Anything forward, December 1st forward, will have a value in projected billing, but theoretically should have nothing in actuals because you have not done month-end close yet. So therefore, you can add the two together and get a total forecast for the year. The challenge becomes, for many of you, the last week of any month, where you start running billing, so you start getting actuals in the system. And because you start getting actuals in the system, the actuals are adding again to the forecast, so you're double counting, okay? So this is where the timing things happen, okay? When do you change the pivot date? When do you run your forecast report? So really that becomes a process definition to make sure you get the most accurate information in the system and the most accurate information on reports. And you usually have some kind of central control. When does the pivot date change within your company? And when do you make sure that TS managers know and executive managers know when to run forecasting or when they want to run a total view, okay? So just know that, again, no silver bullet or 99% answer in this case, but a combination of process definition for when the pivot date is controlled and when you run the forecast report. Just know that simple equations like this are dependent on good process. Okay. Now the other option that you have is, well, what if it's a proposal? I sent the proposal out. I use OpenAir for a little bit of my pipeline reporting as well. From that perspective, you can actually insert or consider probability fields or weighted values. And there's two ways to do it really. One is you can just create a custom field, a numeric custom field that has the value 0.5, 0.6, whatever, and people can select that, and you can use that in a custom calculation to come up with a lower value in your forecast. Why is that important? $1 million potential deal where you got on the phone and you're just guessing that's how much it's going to be, probably shouldn't be factored into your forecast as full $1 million because it's very low probability that you're getting it. In fact, you may only factor that as 10% or 0 in your forecast. But if you are in negotiation for signing a contract, you can't still invoice the customer, but you have a high probability that will close. So you may make that 90% or even 100, and then you would reflect the full value in your forecast. So this is typically related to like a sales methodology as well. The other way to do weighting is to use something called an allocation grid. It is a special type of custom field that allows you to use percentages, and OpenAir will actually use those percentages and roll things up automatically in the system. And that is an internal switch to turn those on. So you can play with those two values again, setting up any kind of weighted value field. If you don't use it on a report, it doesn't impact anything in the system. Okay. So what I'd like to do is show you how I leverage some of those features with the custom calculation and the weighting on dashboards. And those dashboards provide a lot of insight based on, okay, so am I going to hit my goals for the year? How am I doing against forecasts for the next 6 months? Where is it breaking down? And when I apply weighting, how much does it actually equate to based on how qualified the leads are in the system? Okay. So here, for example, this is my budget plan to revenue to hit in the system. This is me using that actual plus forecast value to figure out what do I think I'm going to end up the year with compared to my plan. And if I'm above or below, obviously that tells me a lot of information. How's my forecast looking? Here's a forecast value in the system over the next 6 months. How does that break down based on where I qualify things in the system as far as early leads, signed work, so forth and so on? And then if I apply weighting, how does that impact the actual value? If I'm forecasting $60,000 in the month of December and I apply forecasting, it drops down to $15,000. To me, that means the forecasts have a high volume of just low probability leads in the system, and I may need to work harder to close those leads in order to get information out of the system correctly. Okay. So with that, I hope from this webinar you've learned some information about how the forecasting is used in the system, how you can leverage what you already do in the system to do actual invoicing and revenue, and then be able to get the bonus of forecasting. There is some things to consider in forecasting setup as far as how you forecast time, your project management versus centralized resource management, probably simple versus more complex, custom calculations, all kinds of things that once you sit down and sort of modify or document how you do forecasting as a company and then map that to the configuration items in the process you need to define, you should be able to get a lot of good information out of the system. And as a reminder, where you can find us and talk to us more at Top Step Consulting. We have been in business for almost about 3.5 years now, and we are standing by to help you with any questions. I hope you have been enjoying this Advanced User Webinar Series as we have enjoyed giving it to everyone. And join us for the next one, which will be scheduled in the middle of January.